talk, coming from quite a different perspective, which is around sustainable infrastructure. What is my risk? Darren, over to you.
Quick comms check. Can you hear me?
We can indeed. Thanks,
That's
sir.
Great. So first of all, many thanks to both Sarah and Rose for organising this amazing initiative, and secondly, just giving me the opportunity just to say a few words to kick off today. So as Sarah has said, I'm probably coming at this from a different angle, and probably going to maybe give people some food for thought as we go through the remaining presentations today about maybe different perspectives and sort of some of the questions to ask. In terms of content, I've got a little bit of structure here in terms of the scale of the problem through to a little bit talking about some of the risks, both the sources of the risks and some of the impacts. So a little bit about me. So I've been quite fortunate to have worked sort of across a few different sectors over the years, but I would say it's probably the last 20 of those years where I've very much worked on infrastructure, in particular project management, risk management, and project controls. And as Sarah said, so most of my career up until the last 2 years has been in the UK, and then last 2 years here in Saudi Arabia as well. Fellow of a few institutes, and my angles today. So I was the chair of the Institute of Risk Management in London. So I was chair of their infrastructure risk group. So hence I've a particular interest in this subject, and also I've gone back to school. So I'm currently studying a master's at University of Surrey, and the first module I picked was sustainable infrastructure. So it's quite a passion for mine. And it's interesting to offer some insights today. The picture, so on the top right, this is quite an important picture for me because this completely changed my opinion on a lot of the topics I'll talk about. So behind you is a border checkpoint, and on the other side of that is Yemen. So about 18 months ago, I spent a little bit of time in Yemen looking at some infrastructure projects, what the purpose of them are, how they were being built, and it completely changed. You know, when you're looking at something from a leafy suburb in the UK versus looking at something sort of in a dusty patch of sand in Yemen, it opened your eyes as well. So we'll probably touch on that a little bit as well. So the problem, I won't spend a lot of time on this. You've all pretty much gone through, but some scary stuff. So over the last 70 years, 30% of the world's arable land has become unproductive due to erosion. We move we move more sediment and rock annually, and all natural processes. So as you can start to see some of the link now into sort of raw materials and what we use and how we extract them. And also as well, you know, again, greenhouse gases at crazy levels. Moving on, moving probably a little bit more into the sort of infrastructure, sort of this particular one at the bottom, there's lots of different ways of measuring, but a key thing that's quite important is still the emissions or the impact from the use of infrastructure is way more than the actual construction of it. And although that will change over time, as you'll see, this is something quite important, and you'll see this come up as well. So how we use our infrastructure is probably many times more important than how we actually build it as well. Some of the priorities. So you'll have seen this before, and I think up behind Sarah, up on her wall, you recognize it. The sort of 17 Sustainable Development Goals from the UN, and it's a nice, pretty picture. Everything looks symmetrical and uniform, and it looks easy, doesn't it? And if you go on the website, you'll hear about the decade of action from 2020 to 2030. Act now. So we've got these 17 things, these goals, and we need to take action and act now. But I sometimes, and this goes back, and go back to sort of my trip to Yemen, I've looked at it from a different angle. And you hear about the 3 pillars, and you hear about at the top, the economic pillar, then the social pillar in the middle, and the sort of the environmental pillar. And suddenly when you split the 17 goals apart, you can start to see tensions, potential tensions or conflict between some of them. So if I focus on one particular set of goals, that might be at the risk of achieving some others, in fact, making some others worse. And this is something quite important, is this is not easy. And sometimes, you know, these are not all nice 17 pretty uniform goals. Some of them sort of are sort of at the risk of others as well. So what are some of these sources of risk? And I've set it out in a series of questions, and when you see them, you'll quickly detect the structure. So if you think about it in terms of sort of some of the sources of risk, so when we start to build something, do we need it? Should we build it? What should we build? Moving on, where should we build it? How we build it, how we operate it and maintain it, and finally dispose it. So you can see over the full course of a asset life, from concept all the way through to disposal, we are introducing sources of risk. Some of the decisions we make are introducing risk to infrastructure. And the key link in terms of materials, you know, you could ask, you suddenly look at these questions from the lens of raw materials. Again, these are quite important decisions. Also as well, to think about it, it's not as simple as just asking questions, but also the stakeholders. So we've touched on this. So the opinion or viewpoint of the owner of the asset may be very different from the financier, the user as well. So again, going back, remember we talked about tensions and the 17 goals. You know, so if somebody who's more focused on the economic impact of infrastructure, maybe over the environmental and vice versa. So again, this is quite important. And time. This time over time, your perceptions and the impacts will change over time. We're building for today, and we'll calculate the emissions today. What about into the future as well? So something that might be a poor choice or bad choice today in terms of raw material might be a good choice in the future, and vice versa. So something as well to think about. Moving on, so we've got those questions at the top, you'll see, and I've tried to focus in, because of time, on a couple of them, sort of how we build and operate and maintain some of our infrastructure. And I've picked security of supply as a sort of a key impact. And if you think about raw materials, and particularly rare earth materials, it's a key issue. Is where do we get them, and how do we continue to get them sustainably into the future? You hear phrases about rare earth or elements and metals are now the new oil. It's a little bit ironic, sort of from where I am at the minute. But if you think like China, we're seeing this summer, China apparently controls roughly 90% of these materials. And also things like sand. We think about sort of rare materials as it be these special elements or metals, but even materials like sands are becoming particularly rare, scarce in some parts of the world as well. So why is this relevant today? And if you bring the link in today, and we've seen at the bottom, you'll see the virus, we've got COVID. And if you think about COVID, you think, well, what's COVID got to do with this? Some of the impacts of COVID around supply, if you think around supply around the world, was massive, has been massively disrupted and continues to be in terms of our infrastructure. Think about some of the construction projects, getting materials in, and also think about operations and maintenance, disruption of that because maybe getting certain materials in from certain parts of the world, and hence the link back into China. If key materials have come from a particular part of the world that has been shut down, it's a similar impacts in the future if it was a different type, if it was think about economic, think about the goals, if there was an economic source of risk, you think about trade controls, trade wars, social as well, in terms of not supplying to certain countries, same impact. And the so what from that is about, hence link back to risk, is when you think about all of these things is who actually owns the risk. And if you think about sometimes with infrastructure, we think we've transferred the risk to the EPC contractor who's going to build my infrastructure, and possibly into, if I have a long life design, build and operate contract, I think I've transferred my risk. And whether it's FIDIC Silver Book or FIDIC Gold Book, I think I've transferred my risk, but have I really? Yeah. So just sort of a few points just to wrap up. So I've kept this quite brief, is You know, when you think about sustainable infrastructure, and in particularly the supply of materials and raw materials into the sustainable infrastructure, you've seen the numbers. We have to do something quickly. But actually, most of the short-term positive effect can be delivered through how we use infrastructure rather than how we build, operate, and maintain it. At the same time, we have to balance these pillars. We spoke about the environmental goals, the social goals, economic, and sometimes they conflict with each other, again, depending which stakeholder type you are, and over time as well. So we have to balance these. And ultimately, a lot of the decisions comes down to who owns the risk, and actually who's willing to pay for the mitigation. Yeah, that's quite important. A lot of the decisions come down to that. And when it comes to risk, we spoke about not just the what, but the who's impacted, what their perception is, and the when over time as well. And this is something as well we have to remember is what I think is a risk might be somebody else's opportunity. So if I think extracting raw materials or building some infrastructure in a particular location is a bad thing, for economic reasons and social reasons, for that part of the world, that might be a massive opportunity, and we should recognize that. And then finally, it's not easy, is it? It's balancing all of these things. So just a different perspective, a different viewpoint, and hopefully some of the slides will provoke some questions later on as we go through the presentations. And then finally, I think I'm okay for time, is sort of any non-technical questions. Don't ask me anything technical. Cool. So that's me done, Sarah. So I will hand back to you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Darren, for sharing your perspectives from infrastructure, which is absolutely crucial because there's no point in mining many of the materials that many people on this call do on a day-to-day basis if nobody's going to use them. And of course, a great deal of those materials are used within construction infrastructure as a whole. Just one question, Darren, before we go on to our next speaker. And by the way, I know that you are going to be around for the duration of the session, so please everybody do pass your questions on to Darren online. You mentioned it's not necessarily a question of what is the risk, but who owns the risk. And I guess as well, depending on that person and their perspective, their interpretation of what the risk is, whether it's an opportunity or a threat. I don't know if you can maybe talk quickly to something about people owning risks, and so therefore what can they do about them?
And again, it's quite, if you think about the current situation, so within a lot of big infrastructure projects, there will be a contract form. So it's normally FIDIC, and FIDIC's really black and white as to who owns risk. And when it comes to maybe supply of materials, a lot of that risk is transferred away from the owner or the person who's financing the project or infrastructure to a third party, the contractor. And we think it's clear. We sit back and I've transferred my risk, and then stuff happens. You know, if you think about it, you know, what if there was another major event and it was around scarcity? If I'm operating and maintaining an asset with 100-year life expectancy, and suddenly a particular rare metal or rare element or something goes wrong somewhere around the world, is we think I've transferred that risk to the person who's going to build or operate my infrastructure, but it all comes back to me. And I think that's the bit where this maybe COVID is recognized. So, and what's happening at the minute is there are cases where under the contract, yes, the risk was technically transferred to somebody else, but what's happening is people are using, going back to common law in the courts at the minute and saying, is that fair? Is that reasonable to transfer something that was so almost like the force majeure across? So it's just something to think about. Sometimes we think we've transferred the risk, but have we really? That's the key question.
Brilliant. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together to give Darren his round of applause from behind our silent microphones. Brilliant. Thank you very much, Darren.